If you ever feel like you're being extorted by your software vendor, it's probably because you are. That's what I'm going to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. And when we're helping clients define their digital strategies and ultimately implement whatever technology or technologies they've selected, we find that there's a lot of gamesmanship that's played by software vendors. And software vendors are really the masters of extorting their customers and forcing customers to do things that they may or may not want to do or that may or may not be best for their business. Now, of course, we're all out to make a profit motive, including software vendors, but there's a fine line between profit motive and profit motive at the expense of putting your business at risk. So what I want to do today is chat through and talk through some of the things that are signs of potential vendor extortion, as well as at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about some mitigation strategies you can put in place to ensure that you're in control of the project and not your software vendors. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey. Now let's jump back into today's content. One of the first and most relevant ways that software vendors are creating the sense of customer extortion in 2025 is in the way that they're forcing customers to upgrade their software. So in other words, you have customers that have implemented and spent a lot of money implementing big complex systems years or decades ago, and they're being told that they have to upgrade to a new system in order to continue getting maintenance and support. And the really strange thing about this, and the highly unethical thing about this, in my opinion, is the fact that customers are already paying for support and maintenance as it is, so it shouldn't matter whether or not they upgrade to the new system. Of course, no software vendor can support a system indefinitely, so there needs to be some sort of time box on how long they can provide support. But many of these systems haven't been around that long. It's just that most vendors now are moving to the cloud if they haven't already been in the cloud. And that's really the thing that the software vendors are trying to force, is to get more customers to migrate to their newer cloud solutions. Now, you could argue that some of these cloud solutions might be better for you as a customer, but in my opinion, it shouldn't be the software vendor forcing you or threatening you to move to the cloud solution. So I think that's the big difference between business value you might get out of a newer system versus the fact that you're being forced to do it. And so ultimately, what organizations need to do is upgrade on their own timeline, regardless of any sort of coercion that software vendors might provide. One thing that software vendors are also guilty of is convincing customers that they should go all in on their technology solution. And in particular here, I'm talking about the big ERP software vendors, the vendors that provide end-to-end software capabilities. They will generally try to get their customers to invest as much money as possible in their software, and they'll try to extend their footprint of their technology as broad as possible within the organization. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with the profit motive and capitalism and software vendors trying to sell more software, but there is, again, a fine line between selling more software and doing it at the expense of putting a business at risk. And that's oftentimes what happens, because most of these software vendors can't be everything to everyone within any given organization, yet they try to force the customer's hand. And what this all-in mentality does is it creates vendor lock. And vendor lock is a situation where you can't get out of the situation, or you can't get out of the contract without a severe disruption to your business. So if you think about however many employees you have, however many business processes and functions you have in your organization, if every one of them is using a certain software vendor's system and all the data is housed in that software vendor system, they sort of have you captive, and it's very hard to switch. So that's what vendor lock is, and that's the risk of going all in on one solution. And even though this is something that's very unhealthy for customers, vendors still push this concept very aggressively. Software vendors are also guilty of offering false promises to customers. Now, this isn't all necessarily nefarious behavior on the part of software vendors. They truly do believe some of the things they sell, but the problem is oftentimes they're selling a vision or a state of utopia that just isn't realistic for most organizations. So, for example, when you think about an implementation timeline or an implementation budget or the level of risk of implementing a solution, it's easy for a software vendor to say it's easy to implement, it's not going to cost you that much money, and it's going to be low risk. But the reality is there's a difference between rolling out that software vendor's technology and actually transforming and changing your business and adopting the technology. Those are two very different things. So what ends up happening is people end up with unrealistic expectations about what it's going to take to succeed with that software, and they end up set up for failure because they had these unrealistic expectations from the start, and these expectations were typically set during the sales cycle with the software vendor. And when I say software vendor, by the way, I'm not just talking about the software manufacturer. I'm also talking about the implementer, the technical implementer of that software as well. So when you're evaluating software vendor proposals, you have to take it all with a grain of salt, and you want to make sure you take the time to validate the assumptions they've used, and make sure you add a dose of skepticism to the assumptions that they're providing to you. And this will ensure that you're more likely to create a more realistic implementation timeline and budget for your project. Even though I've shared with you some bad news so far in this video, I have even worse news to share with you now. And this has nothing to do with the software vendors. It has to do with you, the customer. And the problem and the big challenge here is that customers are letting software vendors do this to them. Customers are believing what software vendors tell them. Customers are agreeing to terms that don't make sense. Customers are agreeing to assumptions that aren't realistic. And at the end of the day, it's almost like a buyer beware sort of situation. You have to do your homework. You have to validate, you have to question, you have to understand, and you have to have enough knowledge and foresight to really dig into what the software vendor is suggesting to you. And one way to look at it is if a software vendor offers you something that sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If they're telling you their software is easy to deploy, it's probably not. If they're telling you there's no real risk you need to worry about, there probably is. So you have to go in with the assumption and the mindset that there are risks. This is probably more complex than you realize and or what your software vendor realizes. And it's just going to take you more time, money, and risk than you imagine. And so if you go in with that assumption, you're a lot more likely to end up with a realistic plan, one that reflects reality, and one that has a healthy dose of skepticism to ensure that you're not setting yourself up for failure, but instead you're setting yourself up for success. So the biggest lesson I can leave you with here today is to ensure that you're not letting the software vendors engage in this sort of extortion or coercive behavior. It's really up to you to make sure it stops, and it's up to you to make sure that you do what's right for your business and that you aren't necessarily overly concerned about what the software vendor's motives are. You need to focus more on what your motives are and your priorities, and make sure you work with a partner and a vendor that helps you do that. So it's safe to assume that if you're working with a software vendor, especially one of the bigger software vendors or one of the bigger system integrator consulting firms, you're probably going to experience some of these coercive types of behaviors if you haven't already. So the biggest way that you can overcome this is to educate yourself. Make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into, network with peers, understand what other companies have been through, and don't rely just on what the software vendor feeds you. If they give you a reference, that's great, but they're going to give you the best possible customer reference they can find. It's more important to go find references independently to see what the good, the bad, the ugly was of that software vendor or of the related implementation. The other thing you could do is hire an independent and trusted technology advisor like Third Stage Consulting, one that's not affiliated with a software vendor and one that can help you navigate some of these complexities and acts of extortion along the way. We can help manage that and help leverage our strength in the marketplace to help ensure you get the type of deal and the type of arrangement you're looking for. And then finally, I'd also encourage you to read our annual digital transformation report. It's a report we publish each year that covers a number of implementation best practices, as well as independent software reviews and rankings. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. And one last thing, I'd love to hear your feedback. Have you experienced any of this sort of vendor behavior in your experience? Have you had these sort of coercive behaviors or things that didn't resonate with you? I'd love to hear your comments below, so please drop those. I'd love to keep an eye on what you have to say in your feedback. So if you found this information useful, I hope you have a great day. And that's the software vendors still push this all-in concept to a great deal.